Today we're talking about the hidden reason you keep explaining your goals instead of pursuing them. And here's what nobody tells you. The more time you spend talking about what you're going to do, the less likely you are to actually do it. Not because talking wastes time, but because talking satisfies the same psychological need that execution satisfies, and your brain doesn't know the difference. If you're someone who's always got a goal, who can articulate exactly what you want and why you want it, who loves talking about your plans with friends or online, if people know your ambitions better than they know your actual progress, then what I'm about to tell you will explain why nothing ever actually happens. Because you've turned goal setting into a performance, and performance is a perfect substitute for execution. Your brain gets the identity reward without you having to do the actual work. Let me paint you a specific picture. You've got a goal. Maybe it's a business you want to start, content you want to create, a skill you want to develop. You're excited, so you tell people. You explain the idea. You talk about why it matters. You describe what success would look like. And with every explanation, you feel more real, more like the person who's actually doing this thing. But here's what's happening in your nervous system. Every time you explain your goal, your brain releases dopamine, the motivation chemical, the reward signal. And that dopamine tells your system, we're making progress. We're moving toward the goal, except you're not moving. You're talking. But your brain doesn't distinguish between the two. It just knows that goal-related activity is happening, and that feels like execution. This is what psychologist Peter Gollwitzer discovered when he studied goal pursuit. He found something that contradicts everything the motivation industry teaches. He called it the goal completion effect. And what it shows is that when you tell people about your goals, when you announce your intentions publicly, you're actually less likely to pursue them. Not because you lose motivation, but because you've already received the psychological reward for committing. Gollwitzer's research showed that the moment you vocalize your intention, your brain treats it as partially completed. You've committed, you've announced, you've made it real in the social sphere, and that social reality is enough to satisfy your brain's need for progress. So the urgency to actually execute drops. The internal pressure to move decreases, because in some fundamental way, your nervous system believes you've already started. This is why some of the most verbose goal setters are the least productive people you know. They're not failing because they lack intention. They're failing because they've learned to get their goal satisfaction from explanation rather than execution. But there's a deeper layer to this. When you explain your goals, you're not just getting dopamine. You're also getting identity reinforcement. You're performing a version of yourself to the world. The ambitious version, the driven version, the person who's building something. And that performance is seductive because it feels real. It looks real to other people. And most importantly, it feels like proof that you're becoming that person. Psychologist Erving Goffman studied something he called impression management, the ways we present ourselves to others to create a desired identity. And what he found was that people often work harder on the impression than on the reality, because the impression is more controllable. The impression gets immediate feedback. The impression makes you feel like you're already the person you want to be. But the reality doesn't care about your impression. The reality is silent. The reality doesn't validate you. The reality just requires repetitive, often boring, unsexy action over months or years. So you choose impression. You become the person who talks about goals. The person with big plans. The person everyone thinks is building something. But you're not building. You're narrating. And narration feels almost as good as building. Almost. Here's what makes this even more insidious. When you explain your goals to people, when you get their validation and enthusiasm, that external validation becomes a substitute for internal confidence. You don't need to believe you can do it because other people believe you can. And for a moment, that's enough. That's almost enough. But it's not. Because external validation is unstable. It depends on other people staying invested in your goal. It depends on them continuing to believe in you. And most people's belief in you lasts about 3 weeks. After that, they move on to their own problems. And suddenly you're alone with the goal. And without the external validation, without the performance audience, the goal feels empty. This is why so many people cycle through goals. They announce one, get validation, feel excited, lose momentum when the novelty wears off and the validation stops. Then they announce another goal, reset the validation cycle, and repeat. They're not goal pursuing, they're validation seeking. And goals are just the vehicle for it. Psychologist Baumeister studied this in his research on willpower and found something important. He called it the pre-completion effect. When you mentally simulate completing a goal, when you talk about it in a way that makes it feel real, your brain's urge to actually complete it decreases. Because the simulation satisfies the same neural pathways as the actual completion. In other words, when you spend an hour vividly describing your goal, explaining how you'll do it, talking about what success will feel like, you're essentially pre-experiencing that success. And pre-experience is a poor substitute for real experience. But it's good enough to satisfy your brain's immediate need for reward, so you don't push harder to actually achieve it. This is also why journaling about goals without action doesn't work, why vision boards don't work, why writing down your intentions doesn't work. Not because these tools are inherently bad, but because when you do them, you're creating a mental simulation of completion, and that simulation reduces your motivation to actually execute. But here's where it gets even more specific to the type of person who's listening. There's another mechanism at play, and it's tied to how intelligent and articulate people operate. If you're good with words, if you can explain concepts clearly, if you can articulate your vision in a compelling way, then you have a superpower for goal explanation, and that superpower becomes a trap, because you can make anything sound plausible. You can describe a business that doesn't exist yet in such vivid detail that people believe in it. You can paint a picture of your future so compellingly that for a moment, you believe it too. And belief is enough to get dopamine. Belief is enough to get validation. Belief is enough to feel like progress is happening. But execution doesn't care about your articulation. Execution doesn't reward your ability to explain. Execution just wants repetition, action, the unglamorous, unverbal, unimpressive movement toward the goal one small step at a time. So articulate people often become trapped in a different kind of procrastination, not avoidance procrastination where you do nothing, but explanation procrastination where you do something. You're busy, you're active. You're constantly refining your vision, perfecting your pitch, improving your explanation. But none of that is moving you closer to the actual goal. Let me give you a specific example of how this shows up. You want to build a business, so you work on the pitch. You perfect your explanation of the business model. You practice describing the value proposition. You refine the story of why you're starting it. You explain it to friends, mentors, potential investors. You get validation. People say it sounds great, and you feel like progress is happening, but you haven't validated the business with a single customer. You haven't tested whether anyone actually wants what you're building. You haven't handled rejection or real feedback because you've been in the safe space of explanation, and explanation is always accepted. Explanation never gets rejected. Explanation always sounds good when you're good with words. But the moment you move from explanation to execution, everything changes. Suddenly your idea meets reality, and reality doesn't care how well you explained it. Reality just wants to see if it works. So here's what's happening in your nervous system. You've gotten all the dopamine from explanation. You've gotten all the identity reinforcement from being the person with the plan. You've gotten all the validation from articulating it compellingly. But you haven't gotten the most important thing. You haven't gotten proof. Proof that you can execute. Proof that the idea works. Proof that you're the person you've been claiming to be. And deep down, you know the difference. You know that talking about something isn't the same as doing it. You know that validation for your idea isn't the same as validation from the market. You know that being seen as ambitious isn't the same as being ambitious. And that knowledge creates a quiet shame, a sense that you're performing, that you're not real, that eventually people will figure out that all you do is talk. Psychologist James Clear studied habit formation and found that one of the biggest obstacles to building habits is something he called the premature identity claim. When you announce your identity before you've proven it through behavior, you're at high risk of abandonment, because your nervous system feels like it's already earned the identity. So the urgency to act decreases. Clear wrote, "You don't have to be the person who works out. You only have to be the person who shows up to the gym. You don't have to be the entrepreneur. You only have to be the person who takes one business action today." Because identity is built through behavior, not through announcement, not through explanation, through showing up and doing the thing even when it's uncomfortable, even when nobody's watching, even when there's no validation. That's when real identity forms. So here's what this means. If you're someone who explains your goals more than you pursue them, you need to make a choice. You need to decide whether you want to be seen as ambitious or whether you want to be actually ambitious. Because most of the time, you can't do both. The performance of ambition and the reality of ambition require different activities, and they compete for the same time and energy. Real ambition is quiet. It doesn't need explanation. It doesn't need validation. It just needs repetition. Action. The unglamorous work of showing up when you don't feel like it, of continuing when nobody's watching, of moving forward even when progress isn't visible. So here's your move. For the next 30 days, stop explaining your goals. Not because explanation is bad, but because you need to build real momentum without the dopamine hit from talking. You need to prove to yourself that you can pursue something without getting validation for pursuing it. You need to create evidence that you're actually the person you've been claiming to be. And here's what you'll notice. Without the validation, without the performance audience, without the dopamine hit from explanation, the goal will feel harder. It will feel less exciting. It will feel less real. And that's exactly right. That's the difference between a fantasy goal and a real goal. Real goals are often boring. Real progress is often invisible. Real ambition is often lonely. But real ambition is also the only kind that produces results. Real ambition is the only kind that builds identity. Real ambition is the only kind that creates the proof your nervous system actually needs to believe in you. So stop explaining and start executing. Not dramatically, not publicly, just consistently. And 30 days from now, you won't have a perfect explanation of what you're building, but you will have evidence. And evidence is worth more than explanation. If this explained why you're great at talking about goals but struggling to pursue them, subscribe. Next time, we're breaking down why your self-awareness is making you less effective and how to turn it into an execution weapon.